1925, 1930. The reason for that was my great-grandfather was 5 foot tall. And that was very accessible for him. I'm 6'2", 127 years later, I'm 6'2". So it's very difficult for me to get in here and make the cuts. But for him, it was perfect. Right? So that was the way to do it. And this is called a basket. So this basket is called a basket because they want these shoots to go out and leave this big center open for the sunshine. Because the sun is what affects those clusters of grapes. So when you have a big open area like this, the sun comes down, it perforates, it doesn't burn the grapes. The grapes are all hanging way out here. It allows the grapes to have a natural sun environment. Now what we do today is actually simulate that. We'll show you a little bit when we get a little further on. But this is how it was done in 1925. Okay, then came along guys like me, tall. We'll go across the street here, exact same vineyard, Infidel. These were planted in the 1950s. So throughout the 40s, late 30s, mid-40s, guys got bigger. Okay, we'll do the same thing. We'll just bring the vine up higher. So in the 40s and 50s, again, it's all hand-picked. So all these shoots, basket go out, just like they did before. We just made them higher for a guy like me. Still getting open effect. Still getting the ability to have the clusters of grapes get in there. Couldn't get in there. But there was a really bad, one big problem. It took a lot of hand labor. So it took people to actually come out here and cut those grapes off each one of these shoots. Okay, so that kind of someone started thinking about it in the late 40s and 50s, said, hey, let's make some kind of machine that can knock off those grapes. So a lot of research was done. A guy actually locally here in Lodi was part of the beginning machine. He said, I'm going to make a machine that's going to come along with these big arms and swing back and forth and whack this vine and make those grape clusters shatter off of that. He did. He made the machine. He came along the road, started whacking these vines, got about 6 vines down. He looked back and he says, they're all laying on the ground. All the energy from that hitting this vine was breaking them all off at the bottom. This kind of made it kind of a dilemma because it was great for getting the grapes off, but it was really hard to replace those vines. So he went back to the drawing board. Say, we have to have something here to make the energy get into these cordons. So what we're going to go do next is a vineyard that was adapted when the machine came along. These vines are called head prune. So the head. Next we're going to go to is what they call a bilateral or a bilateral design wire system, which is pretty much predominant today. So they went from pretty much this kind of vineyard in the 40s and 50s to the 60s and 70s. Everybody started putting wires on it for the machine harvester. So we'll take a quick trip over to our Chardonnay and I'll show you what that looks like. Vineyard. Originally this vineyard was planted by my father and it was planted to be a table grape. It was a flame seedless. Found out that the people down south could grow it a lot earlier and faster, and so it kind of killed that whole concept. So my father came along and he grafted this vineyard. He basically cut the trunk off, put a bud in from one of these sticks. So it would be, he'd get that stick that he had, and each one of these little buds becomes grafting material. So he'd put a little V shape. The bud would take that bud out, make a little V shape in the trunk, and he'd insert that, and he'd wrap it with some tape. The little bud would start sprouting, and up it would come to produce a new vineyard, a new vine. So the bottom of this vine was a flame seedless. The top of this vine was now Chardonnay. The interesting thing from a winemaking point of view, when I started harvesting grapes from this and got into the wine business, is I started tasting this strange characteristic that wasn't really a predominantly Chardonnay. It had this more table grape characteristic. So what I was realizing finally was that I was getting both the worlds. I was getting some of the flame character flavors and the Chardonnay flavors ultimately when we got the crop. So this vineyard was set up on what we call a bilateral system. Bilateral meaning two. We put a wire across attaching all the vines together. So you have one continuous system from the end post all the way down, all the way across to the other end post. So the vine itself becomes part of the mechanism of distributing the ability to harvest those grapes and get the energy to have them come off of these cordons. So what happens is basically a big machine comes over the top of this. It has two big arms that go like this, rock back and forth. They impact the vine rotation very quickly, 300 times per minute, and basically what it does is just pops it. It gives it a little boom, and all the grapes that are on there basically just pop off of the rachis or the stems. Now it's all good and fine. We haven't used machine harvesting on our grapes because we hand pick everything, and so the drawback to machine harvester is that it's hard on the grapes, it's hard on the vines. So as a winemaker, it gives you some characteristics that I don't particularly like. So therefore, we machine harvested nothing for ourselves. We just do hand pick. So everybody here has to come in and they lay a bucket underneath here and they pick it by hand, and then we take them in small buckets to the winery. But machine harvesting is an advantage for large growers, and today probably, I guess, 95% of all vineyards are harvested by machines. It saves a tremendous amount of money. So for us to pick this by hand, it costs us about $3,000 an acre. To do a machine costs about $350. So it's 10 times the cost, but I see the advantage of it being in the end result. Another thing you might notice is you see some lines coming along here. You look down, you see about 5 lines in there. Okay, this is cover crop. So when all the rest of the growers are done harvesting the grapes and go on vacation, we go back to work. So we take and make a seed bed. This all gets dished out and cleaned up. It gets irrigated, prepped, and then we come along and we seed it with a seeder. So every one of those rows, the little machine goes along and drops seed into the ground, and that seed starts to come up. You say, well, why do you do that? The reason is in the fall, the good guys, the ladybugs, and the predators that feed on the bad guys in the vineyard, they're up there in the nice green foliage. And so when we get done harvesting, the vine starts to go dormant, those ladybugs don't have a food source because there's no bad guys there. So we establish a seed bed so the ladybugs come down in here and they start gnawing on the bad guys in here until in the spring we disc it up, and then they go back up into the canopy. The other key reason for using cover cropping is during my dad's time, synthetic fertilizers were very cheap. So they used lots and lots of nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen. It's not the best cultural practice, and so when my generation came along, we said, no, it's not a good idea. So all of this material is what we call biomaterial. It'll grow up to be about that high, and the roots will be full of nitrogen. When we just get under in the spring, that nitrogen gets released to the vines, and it's a natural way of supplying nitrogen into the ground for the vines for that next year. And a lot easier to control how much you're actually using. So that's kind of the basics of the cordon system. This has been around for years and years and years. Not many adaptations to it other than what we did. This is called a catch wire. So basically a lot of these vineyards don't have this. There's no wire systems above it. They just have a bilateral system. So what happens is these long shoots start to look like a bush, and we call them the California sprawl because they get really bulky and bushy, and they kind of roll like an umbrella, and they cover up all the grapes. When my dad took me out as a young man, he said, look at that beautiful vineyard, big green bush. And today, when I take my son out and say, look at this beautiful vineyard, you can see all the grapes, and the vine looks kind of weak, and you don't have that big green effect. So we're in the business of growing grapes, not the lumber that produces the grapes. So the less lumber we produce on those grapes, the better the quality of the grapes. Same thing, we brought a trunk up, in this case 2 trunks up, and instead of bringing it out in the middle and then stretching it out on one wire, we crossed it over, brought them out 3 feet, and then brought them out again. So now, instead of being a bilateral or 2 cordons, we now have 4 cordons to this vineyard, this vine. So what we've done is we've stressed the vine, putting more shoots on it,
right?
And therefore, by doing that, reducing the amount of heavy wood that we have. And this particular variety, this is Merlots that we're in right now, that we're pruning, or they're pruning right now, is quite unique because Merlots don't like nitrogen, but they love nitrogen. So if you give a lot of nitrogen to a Merlot, they shatter and they don't produce a good crop. So what we've done in this vineyard as well, and again notice some weeds growing. Same thing, we did a different weed here. Those over there were to help the nitrogen and add more nitrogen. So this is Merced rye. It'll grow up to be about 5-6 feet high. And it actually will takes up a lot of nitrogen. So it basically pulls nitrogen away from the vineyard. So when we come back in here and mow it and disc it back under, then it has to have more energy and more nitrogen to decompose that rye, leaving less nitrogen, less growth on this vine. If we didn't have that, this vine ultimately would adjust itself and get more and more dense. So again, the idea is the same as when we started in that vineyard, the old vineyard we call the head prune. We had that center open, so sunlight as you can tell, the sun's coming down on us now. It has to come into the center. So by stretching it out that 3 feet in the middle, we've opened up these cordons and we've left the center open to get more filtered light into the grapes. So that's the Geneva double curtain system. It's worked excellent for our reds programs. We don't use it on the whites because you get a lot more sun in this situation and you devigor the vine a lot more. So if you had a Chardonnay like this with very small shoots, there'd be a lot of burn, what we call sunburn. There'd be too much sun. So it's kind of a winemaking and viticulture is simple matter of making sure everything is in balance. The vine has to be balanced, has to have proper amount of shoots, and you'll get the right crop. So just a quick thing on pruning. So what they're doing right now is they're taking all of this, they're trying to determine which one they want to use. So in this case, this is the stronger of the shoots. So they'll come along and they'll cut off all of these, all of that, and then they're going to leave 2 buds. So there's a bud right there, and there's a bud right there. So they'll go above that, cut that off, make sure everything else is clean. So in the spring, this bud will produce another shoot, and this bud will produce another shoot. And that's where your crop comes from. So it's a very fastidious, slow job, if you can imagine going along and doing this all day long.
Well, how many acres too? I mean, it's a...
Now we have 500 here, so
Whew.
These guys can prune roughly about an acre a day each.
Wow.
So it's a lot of days. So we're in here pruning usually 6 weeks to 8 weeks. Everything has a sequential way of doing it. According to what ripens first, that's what you prune first. So our Chardonnays were pruned first. Obviously, they're all done. The next thing that comes in ripe is our Old Vine Zins, and that was next done. So now the Merlots are next. After the Merlots, we'll have the Petite Syrahs, and then Cabernet. And so that's kind of where the order of it goes. You take care of what's first.